In 1970, the typical American family could buy a house for a little over 2 years of their income. Today, that same family needs roughly 5 years of income for the same house. And in cities like Los Angeles or San Francisco, it's closer to 10. That's not a small shift. That's the entire foundation of the American middle-class dream quietly moving twice as far out of reach in a single lifetime. And here's what makes this video different from every other housing is expensive video you've watched. I'm not going to tell you it's because of greedy landlords or evil hedge funds buying up your neighborhood, because, and this is going to surprise you, the data mostly says that's not actually the main reason. The real story is stranger, more structural, and honestly, more fixable than the villain narrative you've been sold. Let's actually open the blueprints on this one.
Let's start with a number that should genuinely unsettle you. In 1970, the price-to-income ratio in America, meaning how many years of gross income it takes to buy a median home, sat at roughly 2.3. By 2024, that ratio would climb to about 5.1, the highest level ever recorded. And this isn't just a national abstraction. In Boston, for example, the median home cost about $19,600 in 1970 against a median income of roughly $9,100. By 2022, that same home cost nearly $685,000, while income had only grown to around $106,000. Buying power for an ordinary family in that single metro fell by more than half over 50 years. This is the part most people get wrong. It's not that houses got dramatically better. A modern 3-bedroom home isn't 5 times more livable than one from 1970. The house didn't change nearly as much as the price did. So if the product didn't change that much, something underneath it did. And that's where this video is actually going to take you, underneath the house, into the land, the rules, and the money.
Here's a distinction almost nobody makes explicitly. When you buy a house, you're buying 2 completely different things bundled into one price. You're buying the physical structure, lumber, wiring, drywall, a roof, and you're buying the land underneath it. The structure depreciates like any building material does over time. The land, especially in a desirable location, does the opposite. It appreciates, often dramatically, because land in a place people want to live is fundamentally limited in a way that houses themselves are not. You can always build another house. You cannot build another downtown Los Angeles. This is why identical floor plans can sell for wildly different prices depending purely on location. The lumber and labor to build a 1,500 square foot home costs roughly the same whether it's built in rural Ohio or coastal California. The price difference between those two homes is almost entirely a story about land value, not construction value, about how many people want to live near that particular patch of ground and how much of that ground is actually available to build on. The house is just what's sitting on top of the real asset. The land is the actual story.
So if desirable land is limited, the obvious response would be to build more housing on the land we do have. Taller buildings, smaller lots, more units per block. In most American cities, that's not just difficult. In enormous swaths of land, it's flatly illegal. This comes down to zoning, the local rules that dictate what can legally be built where. In many American cities, the majority of residential land is zoned exclusively for single-family detached homes. That means even if a developer wanted to build a duplex, a fourplex, or a small apartment building on a given lot, the law simply won't allow it, regardless of demand. Add to that a web of additional restrictions, minimum lot sizes, parking requirements, height limits, lengthy permitting and public review processes that can take years and cost enormous sums before a single foundation is poured, and you get a system that structurally throttles new housing supply exactly in the places where demand is highest. This isn't a conspiracy. It's usually well-intentioned local rules, often driven by existing homeowners who understandably want to preserve their neighborhood's character, protect their own property values, or avoid more traffic and noise. But the cumulative economic effect across thousands of cities making the same locally rational choice is a national housing supply that simply cannot expand fast enough to meet demand where people actually want to live. Nobody had to be greedy for this to happen. 1,000 reasonable local decisions can still add up to one deeply unreasonable national outcome.
Restricted supply explains a lot, but the last 2 decades added a second force on top of it, the price of money itself. When interest rates fall, mortgages become cheaper, which means buyers can afford to bid more for the same house without their monthly payment changing much. Through the 2010s and especially during 2020 and 2021, mortgage rates fell to some of the lowest levels ever recorded, and buyers used that cheap credit to bid prices up sharply, competing over a housing supply that, as we just covered, wasn't growing nearly fast enough to keep pace. Then, starting in 2022, rates rose sharply to fight inflation. You'd expect that to cool prices significantly, and it did slow things down, but it also created a strange side effect economists now call the lock-in effect. Millions of homeowners had refinanced into ultra-low 3% mortgages during the cheap money years. Once rates climbed towards 7%, those homeowners had almost no financial incentive to sell, because moving would mean trading their cheap old mortgage for an expensive new one. So a huge number of homes that would normally have come onto the market simply didn't, tightening supply even further at the exact moment high rates were already squeezing buyers from the other direction. Cheap money inflated the price. Expensive money didn't deflate it back down. It just froze the whole market in place.
Now let's deal directly with a villain most people already have in mind: giant investment firms buying up entire neighborhoods. This narrative exploded online, with viral claims that Wall Street firms bought as much as 44% of homes sold in a given year. That number is not real. According to data cited by multiple housing research firms, large institutional investors, the kind buying 1,000 or more properties, have never exceeded roughly 2 to 2.5% of total home purchases nationally, even at their peak. It's true that investors overall, including everyday individuals, now account for a genuinely large and growing share of home purchases, close to a third of transactions in recent data. But the overwhelming majority of that activity, somewhere around 85 to 91% of all investor-owned homes, belongs to small operators who own fewer than 10 properties. That's often just a family that bought a second property to rent out, not a hedge fund. Meanwhile, the largest institutional landlords have actually been selling more homes than they're buying in recent quarters, not accumulating an ever larger empire. None of this means investor activity is harmless. In certain hot local markets, concentrated investor buying absolutely can squeeze out first-time buyers on the specific homes those investors compete for. But as the single explanation for a national affordability crisis, the Wall Street villain story simply doesn't survive contact with the actual purchase data. It's a much less satisfying answer than evil hedge funds, but the real culprit is boring, structural, and a lot closer to your own city council than to Wall Street.
Even where builders are legally allowed to build, actually constructing a home has gotten meaningfully more expensive in much of the country, pushing up wages in the trades faster than general inflation in many regions. Materials costs are volatile and were hit hard by pandemic-era supply chain disruption and have never fully settled back to pre-pandemic norms. On top of that, the same permitting delays we covered in the zoning chapter don't just block projects entirely. They add real carrying costs to every project that does get approved, since developers are paying interest and holding costs the entire time a project sits waiting for sign-off. None of these forces are villains in the way people want a villain to be. They're closer to friction. Dozens of smaller cost increases stacking on top of each other, each individually reasonable, collectively making every new home meaningfully more expensive to bring into existence than it was a generation ago.
Here's where this video gets genuinely hopeful, because this problem isn't universal. Some cities have deliberately chosen a different path. Tokyo is the case most often cited by housing researchers. Since national zoning reforms simplified Japan's building rules decades ago, local neighborhood opposition has far less power to block new housing than it does in most American cities, and Tokyo has consistently added housing units faster than it's added new households for years. The result, for a long stretch, was a large, affordable, and remarkably stable rental and ownership market in one of the world's biggest cities, even as its population kept growing. It's worth being honest here rather than oversimplifying. In the past few years, even central Tokyo has seen new condominium prices climb to record levels, driven mainly by rising construction costs and land scarcity in the most central districts specifically. A reminder that supply-friendly zoning helps enormously, but it isn't a permanent immunity from every economic pressure we've covered in this video. Still, compared to most major global cities, Tokyo's decades-long track record of building enough housing to roughly match demand remains one of the strongest real-world counterexamples to the idea that expensive housing is simply inevitable in a growing city. Expensive housing isn't a law of nature. In the places willing to actually build enough of it, it turns out to be a solvable problem.
So where does that leave you, watching this from wherever you are right now? First, understanding this actually matters for how you vote and engage locally, more than almost any other economic issue covered on this channel. Zoning decisions happen at the city and county level, often at sparsely attended public meetings, which means a small number of engaged residents, for or against new housing, can swing outcomes that affect an entire region's affordability for decades. If this topic frustrates you, your city's planning commission meetings are a far higher leverage place to act than any online comment section. Second, smaller scale solutions are already spreading. Accessory dwelling units, small secondary homes built in an existing backyard, have been legalized in a growing number of cities as a lower friction way to add housing supply without changing a neighborhood's basic character. Modular and factory built construction is slowly bringing down the cost and time to build. None of these fixes are a silver bullet on their own, but stacked together, they represent a genuine, ongoing shift in how seriously this problem is being taken. Third, and maybe most importantly, this isn't a story about individual failure. If you feel like homeownership is further away than it was for your parents, that's not a personal financial failing. It's a measurable, documented structural shift in the market you're operating in. Knowing that doesn't pay a down payment.
But it does mean you're allowed to stop blaming yourself for math that changed underneath an entire generation. The system that made housing this expensive was built by choices. That also means it can be rebuilt by different ones. Housing costs can feel like weather, something that just happens to you. But almost everything in this video traces back to decisions made by people in city halls and central banks that could plausibly be made differently. If this changed how you think about the price of your next home, subscribe, because next we're breaking down why your grocery bill went up so much faster than your paycheck, and it's a strangely similar story.